You're listening to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, where we do fast, fun, free daily deep dives into books of the Bible. And right now, we're going through Esther.
We got to talk a little bit about the end of Darius and the beginning of Xerxes and the pressures that came along with that transition and what was going on. Now, if you remember nothing about Persia, the one thing that pretty much comes to mind for everybody, just from cultural osmosis, maybe a class somewhere, maybe something, maybe just conversation, maybe bumper stickers depicting Spartan helmets and stuff on tough guy Ford F-150s, is that there was a fight between the Persians and the Greeks. I think everybody has some cultural, historical recollection of this. And a big part of the reason that we know about these fights and the characters and the personalities that go along with it in such detail is because of our buddy who I keep mentioning, the historian Herodotus, a Greek guy from Halicarnassus who at times in his writing seems sympathetic to Persian things, at times in his writing seems very sympathetic to Greek things, but he traveled all around, he interviewed people himself, and he gives us a very colorful account of the conflict between these two cultures. So we don't know as much about the Persians going off and fighting the Scythians. We know it didn't go well. Scythians are hard to beat. Ancient Ukrainians, they don't give up ground easily. We know some stuff about the Persians fighting against the Egyptians. We hear a little bit from Egypt about that. We know some stuff about the Persians going off and fighting into the stands and into India, but not a lot, especially when compared to how much we know about their fight with the Greeks. So there's this big question that comes along with studying this moment in Persian history. And the question is, were the Greeks the biggest deal to the Persians? Were the Greeks the arch rivals to the Persians that we might imagine them to be? Or does it just seem like that because we hear about this story from a Greek historian, and really the Persians had much bigger fish to fry? Well, I'm going to talk about the story a little bit, and you can be the judge of that. Darius was a dude who, as I've mentioned several times, was a king who was a master propagandist. He was a master administrator. He was fantastic at building a structure that could outlive him and that could bear the weight of this massive, multi-ethnic, multiracial, multilingual, multicultural empire that he was trying to preside over. And he was wildly effective as not just an administrator king, but also as a warrior king. He had to put down all kinds of rebellions. I mean, this idea of an empire this big is still relatively new. And of course, all these people groups out at the fringes are going to try just ignoring the orders of a king who sits far away. I mean, wouldn't you at least consider that, especially if the idea of a mega nation was one that hadn't really existed in the world yet to date? So Darius, he's always fighting everybody, and you can look at that and be like, well, that's because he's a mean warmonger. And yeah, probably, maybe. But also you could look at that and say, well, Persia was pretty enlightened and pretty cool. And wherever Persia went, generally pretty good things followed compared to what had been there before. The Greeks, though, they begged to differ. The Greeks had a primitive version of democracy that they had cooking and a very distinct culture from the rest of the world. They didn't have an empire. They had little tiny city-states. So the Greeks are not one thing. There's a lot of different microcultures within the Greek world, and Greece especially is a lot like the Black Hills of South Dakota, where I live. You got other mountainous parts of the world like the Colorado Rockies, where the mountains are very big and very open with very huge valleys. The scale is just gigantic. It's not gulchy. The landscape isn't best defined as a whole bunch of narrow little valleys. The Black Hills, which is sort of the first mountain range of the American West where I live, it's very gulchy, which is a part of the reason that it got populated. Gulches are kind of gold traps, natural sluice boxes for that valuable space rock that everybody wants to get out of the ground. And so here you can have towns that are just a few feet apart. I mean, less than a mile apart, but there's a big ridge in between them and you can't really hear what's going on in the other town. And they're just completely separate gold camps, completely separate things. Greece has a lot of that feel geographically. There's a ton of stuff crammed into really a relatively small area that enabled a ton of diversity. Sparta was nothing like Athens. And Sparta and Athens, for that reason, didn't usually get along back then in the days of Darius. They were usually healthy rivals, with the Athenians leaning more into an aristocratic, wealthy, and different representatives, both from a military and a social perspective, would come forward there. People of certain standing could give input. And you can still go to Athens and go to the places where these conversations took place. Of course, famously in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul goes to Athens, and he goes to the high area in the middle of Athens. There was a place where people talked, Mars Hill. There were some churches that were named after that were popular in the 2000s and the 2010s. And you can go and you can see the spot. So Athens has a very different feel than Sparta, where Sparta, everything is about military participation. And the basic military unit of the Spartans is the hoplite. The hoplite is that soldier that is pretty heavily armored. They've got a long spear, and they've got a round shield with that iconic Greek lambda on it. And the Spartans were just brutal in terms of the way they thought about their citizenry and how they trained up their young men and their young women, all to support this warrior culture that required such a strong degree of built-in discipline in your mindset and in your attitude toward your fellow man. All of that was necessary to make the shield walls that were the backbone of their military work. Your shield overlaps with the guy next to you, and you're responsible for yourself, but you're also responsible for them, and you function as a unit. Well, as it turns out, this hoplite military unit that was most exemplified by the Spartans, it turns out that that's a kryptonite for how the Persians do warfare. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later on. So Sparta, which is a little bit south and west of Athens on the next peninsula down, Athens is on the little Attican Peninsula. And then to get down to the Peloponnesian Peninsula, you go through this super narrow little chunk of land, which is where historical Corinth is. And eventually the Romans built a canal there. And you go down from Corinth, and then you get into the super ancient city of Argos, and into the super ancient city of Sparta, which there's really not much to see there. There's not much left of Sparta anymore, but it was a big deal back in the day. And there's some other really prominent Greek city-states up and around the Greek mainland, getting up toward Macedonia and stuff. But then there are also a bunch of Greek city-states back in the day in Western Turkey, Asia Minor. And they all share language and, to a degree, culture, but they're, again, not an empire. What happens then is, under the reign of Cyrus and Darius, the Persians expand way west into Asia Minor. They show up demanding a gift of earth and water. And the idea is, you are about to come under the umbrella and the protection of the great King of Kings, the King of all things, the King of Persia, and you're going to give us a gift symbolic of your land, your earth, and your water. And in doing so, you become a vassal state, and you're going to owe certain things to Persia, and Persia is going to provide certain things to you. And what we see is this massive mingling of Greek and Persian culture, even language. And so Herodotus gives us most of the names by which we know all of these colorful characters from Persia, the ones, Darius and Cyrus and Xerxes. But those are Greekifications of those names. They're just the ones that have come down to us through history. Well, if you go and look at that Behustan engraving that Darius did, one of the languages that's up there is Old Persian. And the Old Persian engraving reveals to us that, well, the Greekification of the names don't sound exactly like how the name sounded in Old Persia. So I don't think, for example, Darius, as he's raising Xerxes, his son, I don't think they're all sitting around the table for Thanksgiving, and Xerxes is like, gee whiz, father, you are Darius, the great king, and I am so proud to be Xerxes, your son. And then I don't think Darius was probably like, Xerxes, you're the best. And then he scruffs his hair or anything like that. No, I think that Old Persian would have been what they were using to communicate with each other with. And I think probably Aramaic, the evidence supports, would be the next language that they would have used. But we encounter the story with the Greekification of the place names and the people names. And at times when you go through the Old Testament, you'll see the Greekification of those names. At other times, you see the Babylonification of names from Babylon and Persia and so forth. Then at other times, you'll see versions of the names where you have to think a little bit to figure out exactly what you're looking at. So Greece in that regard has a really big influence on Darius, on Xerxes, on the whole story that we're looking at. But for today, in this part of the story, the big thing to know is that that influence wasn't entirely one born out of fighting. Probably half the Greeks, in terms of just raw population, gave the gift of earth and water to Cyrus, to Darius, to Xerxes. And they were like, yeah, Persia's pretty great. We can even mush our languages together and understand things about each other. And we like this arrangement and we're happy with it. And we wish these other stupid Greeks would just get on board because it's a pretty good deal. And we actually enjoy a relatively healthy amount of independence and it's economically prosperous for us and we like it. But the further west you get off of that Asia Minor mainland Turkey and out into mainland Greece, it's just the looser and weaker the tether gets back to Persia. So I don't think there's any coincidence that the further west you go, the less interested Greek city-states were in cooperating with Persia. And so it's a mix of both that cooperation with Persia of some Greeks and that resistance to Persia on the behalf of some other Greeks in the late 500s and early 400s during the reigns of Cyrus and Darius and Xerxes that causes this cultural exchange and this massive amount of influence that the Greeks have on the Persians and the Persians have on the Greeks, and that the whole thing has on what goes on in the Bible and the intertestamental period in the eras that we're looking at right here. I know most of you, if you're here, you're like, the history is fun. That's enjoyable. We like filling that in. I know there are a few of you who are like, I just really like the Bible side and the extra biblical history stuff. It's a little much for me. It's not my wheelhouse. Hey, I'm so grateful that you trust me and you're willing to let me build out that story for you so that we can pay it off as we get into the book of Esther moving forward. Next time around, we're going to look at more about how the Greeks and the Persians came to be at war with each other and how that fight trickled on down from the reign of Darius to the reign of his son, Xerxes. All right, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.
This podcast exists because many of you kick in to make it happen, even though you don't have to. Learn more at thetmbh.com/support.